Hello and welcome to episode 38 of Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics, the podcast where we are taking a chronological look through the Walt Disney animated classics to see which ones really hold up to that prestigious title, albeit in our case, a more refined, exclusive Waly Gisnep animated classic. As always, I am Liam and I am joined by my very good friend Ben. Ben, which film is up for consideration this week?
This week, Liam, we're looking at 2002's Lilo and Stitch. One of the few films of this period that was both a critical and commercial success. But of course, here at Waly Gisnep, we don't look at films in the context of when they came out, but how they hold up nowadays. So Liam, what is your history with Lilo and Stitch?
Strangely enough, I think my first encounter with this film was actually through the appearance of Stitch in Kingdom Hearts 2, because I think at this point, I'd kind of moved away from Disney. I was around sort of 12, 13, and I'd sort of felt that I was a bit too old for Disney films. I distinctly remember the marketing for this film. I think it was actually quite interesting. They lent into Stitch's anarchic nature. It's often him like ruining things. And that was very much carried over to his appearance in Kingdom Hearts, where he shows up as a kind of support summon and he very much breaks the fourth wall and just starts interacting with all of your gauges, giving you buffs and taking out enemies. And for the longest time, that was my exposure to the character and by extension, I suppose, the film. I probably didn't really watch the actual film until I was a late teenager, maybe. And it's one that I watched and sort of went, yep, okay, that's a film, and then moved on from. And it's only the last few years or so where I've revisited it. What about yourself?
Similar to yourself, really.
Kingdom Hearts 2, then.
Sorry, let me rephrase that. I've never played Kingdom Hearts. And I never will. I remember this film coming out and there being a lot of marketing around it, and I remember there being all the sequels and other bits and pieces. I could tell this was one that was quite big, compared to a lot of the films of this decade, where it's only afterwards when I went back and looked at the list, I was like, that was a Disney film? Or I don't even remember this coming out. This is only my second time watching it, and both those watches have been as an adult. My first time watching it, I very much felt I was missing something, because I know this is a film that is widely loved, and I didn't feel I got a lot out of it. Interestingly, there's a Disney group I'm a member of on Facebook, which is how I actually first had contact with Tao when we did the interview back with him, and someone did a poll on there asking people who their favourite Disney character was, and Stitch was number one, beating out Elsa and all the Disney princesses and all that sort of stuff. So this is clearly a film a lot of people have a lot of passion for.
I think a lot of that definitely comes from the character of Stitch, as you say. Personally, for me, Stitch is one of three Disney characters who I consider to be the most adorable, the other two being Dumbo and Baymax. And Stitch is very, very different to both of those characters.
I don't dislike Stitch, but I would not put him in the same league as Dumbo and Baymax. Baby Bolt, I'd put above Stitch.
Baby Bolt isn't in most of the film, though. And also that's a puppy, so it's cheating. And also it sounds like John Travolta, which, that's not a cute voice. Chris Sanders' Stitch voice is amazing. So shall we dive into the plot then?
Let's do it, because the premise of this film is pretty nuts.
I distinctly remember the marketing for this film, and at no point did I think it would open on a Galactic Federation ship with just an array of aliens discussing genetic experimentation.
In some ways, that is what I expected from this film. It's what happens later in the film that I definitely wasn't prepared for. So yeah, we get this opening of a lot of characters who frankly look like they're from Abe's Odyssey, holding some kind of criminal trial for this mad scientist, which is, I mean, it's just David Ogden Stiers doing his most ridiculous Russian accent possible.
It's my favourite David Ogden Stiers performance in Disney. I absolutely love Dr. Jukiba.
And indeed, Dr. Juba is being tried for genetic experimentation, and we meet Experiment 626, aka Stitch, who doesn't really seem to understand what's going on, and Dr. Juba acknowledges that he has deliberately made Stitch to be almost indestructible and an agent of complete chaos and destruction.
A couple of things really stand out to me in this opening. One is outside of the main aliens, every other alien on this ship is absolutely adorable. They look like they're ripped out of Winnie the Pooh or something.
Yeah, which is all the more weird that Captain Gantu is this enormous shark creature that's also an elephant and is absolutely massive.
And then you throw in Kevin Michael Richardson's glorious voice on top of it, and it's such a funny contrast to me that this seems to be the head of security on this very docile ship of, as I say, it's some kind of galactic federation. We've got the Grand Councilwoman, voiced by Zoe Cadwell, who is, as you say, feels ripped out of Abe's Odyssey, and it's this very strange and serious tone to the character that feels more akin to, it's almost as if they're playing off we've just had the Star Wars prequels at this point. And tonally, this opening scene is so strange because it's this very serious action sequence offset by clearly a very chaotic and anarchic character in the form of 626. And it's just such a strange opening where we're following Stitch escaping, where he eventually steals a police cruiser and manages to jump into hyperdrive, escaping the Federation and seemingly looking like he's going to crash land into Earth.
And as luck would have it, Stitch manages to land on Hawaii, Stitch being unable to swim because he sinks. So him landing on this island in the middle of a huge swathe of ocean is a stroke of luck, at least for him. So the Grand Councilwoman decides to send Agent Pleakley and Dr. Jumba after 626. Agent Pleakley is very clearly heavily influenced by Mike Wazowski from Monsters, Inc. He's a panicky, stressed, one-eyed thing. There's also a joke about Earth is protected because the mosquito is an endangered species and humans are its main food source. Now, I think this is meant to be a sort of throwaway gag because they call back to it at the end, but I was like, that seems pretty dark given mosquitoes kill more humans than any other creature on the planet.
That is a very good point that I hadn't considered watching this. We're also not a food source, which is really annoying. They just use us for breeding.
You're annoyed that we're not a food source.
I'm annoyed that mosquitoes are so dangerous and they're not even feeding off us. They're just using us to breed.
So what you're saying is, if you're going to be killed by something, you want it to at least be getting a meal out of it.
Exactly.
Right.
I quite like Pleakley, voiced wonderfully by Kevin MacDonald of The Kids in the Hall fame, who, as you say, like, that's the perfect casting if you want a panicky, anxious, and sort of uptight character. But what I love about this is a 10-minute intergalactic action sequence before we even get the title sequence, let alone meet the other half of our titular pair.
We criticised Atlantis for putting an action sequence at the start just because it knew it needed to open with something exciting, even though narratively it skews the rest of the film a bit. I think this works really well, as you get this contrast between these two characters' lives. So you get the chaos and high technology, high stakes life of Stitch, and then we cut to the rolling, relaxing waves of Hawaii and Lilo feeding a fish a sandwich. Side note, when did we start doing credits at the start again? Because they do that in this film for some reason.
I think this is a blip in that journey, to be entirely honest. I can't remember it in Atlantis, and I don't think it happens in any of the future ones. To be fair, though, after the audience has sat through a 10-minute animated spectacle, I think you deserve a little bit of credit for your work at that point.
Imagine if that's how it was in every one of these films. When there was a good scene, they just threw in a few credits. Like, God, that stampede in The Lion King was great. Here's just a bunch of names. As we say, we're introduced to the character of Lilo, the other titular character. Now, Liam, how do you feel about Lilo? Because this is another child voice actor.
You know, I hadn't even considered that watching this film, but you're right, it is a child voice actor doing, frankly, a fantastic performance. I really like the character of Lilo. I love that her introduction is this strange rant about a fish that controls the weather and having to feed it tuna, followed by her immediately attacking another girl and apparently biting her. And I really like that the film isn't really holding its punches.
Neither's Lilo.
The film isn't really holding its punches with a representation of a young child from a broken home with emotional issues. It's very realistic, like not excusing it, but that a troubled child would respond with violence. And we see after that scene that she is an outsider from her group. The rest of the girls think she's weird and they don't want to play with her. There's also an underlying suggestion that actually there's an element of poverty here. And of course, that's making her more of an outsider. And it's just really impressive to see from Disney something that isn't so squeaky clean and fits the nuclear family traditional narrative. Obviously, we've seen missing and dead parents before, but we've never seen a child sort of show the emotional scars that go alongside that. And really, that's what this film is entirely about. So I love the character of Lilo.
The level of nuance here is so impressive because you're right, these behaviours are believable and they manage to get the right balance of sometimes it's a bit funny, like Lilo just immediately starts leathering this other kid when they make the slightest comment about them. And Lilo often seems quite confident, so when they're playing with dolls, she's made her own doll, as you say, because it's implied that they can't afford to buy one, which is the first note of several I've put. Her making her own doll to play with them is absolutely heartbreaking. But Lilo seems pretty nonplussed by it all and confident, and you think, okay, this is kind of what this character's about. But actually, when she's vulnerable, we see how deep those wounds run. And again, that's what people are like. They aren't just, I've suffered this trauma, so I'm always sad. But it underpins everything that Lilo experiences and all the ways she behaves. And I was really surprised rewatching this with how nuanced and perceptive the writing and portrayal of her is.
And it's done with a great amount of care and respect where, as I say, they're not making a big deal of poverty or the outsiderness. It's just there's these little hints every so often where it's like, yeah, that's how this situation is. And it just feeds into who she is as a character. But alongside Lilo, we also meet really the true hero of this film, which is her sister Nani.
So we're not immediately told what happens to Nani and Lilo's parents, although it's clear from very early on that they are missing, and Nani is trying to do her best to both be a young woman in her own right, be an older sister to Lilo, and also fill in those parental roles for Lilo, whilst not having those parental roles herself. Again, and I'm going to say this about several characters in this film, but it would be so easy to either make Nani this Mary Sue character who's amazing at everything, or almost to make her the villain, and we see her through Lilo's eyes, but their relationship again is complex. Initially they're shouting and screaming at each other, but clearly they need each other a lot. Again, one of the many heartbreaking lines in this film is a little bit later on, where they've made up after an initial argument, and they're sat on Lilo's bed. Lilo just says to her, "I like you better as a sister than a mom." And oh my god, is that heartbreaking.
So one thing in particular I love about this relationship is we're joining these characters at the most important part of this relationship, which is where social services are bringing out the big guns, in this case in the form of Cobra Bubbles, who says that he is the one they send when things go wrong, and things have gone very wrong. We see Nani rushing home after Lilo is not at the school, and we see that Lilo has nailed the door shut and is moping and listening to Elvis. This is when the social worker Bubbles shows up, and we get into the house. The house is a mess, which is telling us visually, alongside the presence of Bubbles, just how poorly they're both coping with this situation, which is wonderful, because a different story could have started with the death of their parents and shown the decline, and then this had been the start of, say, the third act. But instead, we're jumping in at what matters, which is it's not going well, they need help, but the help that is available is not necessarily something that is good for them, i.e. state intervention. This is a Disney film, by the way, just as a reminder.
Yeah, as you said, it's incredibly common in Disney films for there to be one or both parents missing, and orphans, again, are a very common device, not just in Disney, but in a lot of literature and cinema. But this is one of the very, very few films I can think of that really focus on the reality of it, whilst it also still being a light-hearted kids film with a sense of humour. Again, Cobra Bubbles, I think, is one of those fantastic characters where, again, I think there's some good jokes linked to him, but it would be so easy to make him the villain. He's this big, imposing guy in a suit. He's incredibly serious and straight-laced, but he is a good guy. He is seeing a child in basically a state of neglect and saying that an intervention has to take place and things have to change. As an audience, we're not placing a judgment on Nani, but we're also not seeing Cobra as a villain. We're seeing him as you say, when things go wrong. There's some really nice stuff where, again, he's squatting down and talking to Lilo as a social worker would. Lilo's telling him that she has a balanced diet and she does all these activities as Nani desperately mimes it. Lilo loses the understanding and starts saying that Nani disciplines her 5 times a day with bricks in a pillow. It's such a good sequence. And again, there's so much going on here between these characters. It's really strong.
If I can jump ahead a bit, I think you've nailed one thing that's really good about Cobra Bubbles, which is how imposing he is and how easy it would have been to make him the villain. And there's a part later on where Ving Rhames' performance completely shifts because up to this point, he is trying to encourage Nani to basically meet the demands of looking after a young person. And it's very much kind of a scare tactic and saying, look, if you can't do this, we're going to have to take Lilo away. And then it hits a point later in the film where Ving Rhames' performance is completely different and is so sympathetic towards Nani when he says, you need to consider what's best for Lilo, even if it removes you from the picture. And as you say, it would have been so easy of them to make him the villain. But instead, he is just part of the system that is trying to support them. And I love that this is being dealt with in a film. I have a quick question, which is after Bubbles leaves, does Lilo climb into a dishwasher in your version? Because you've got the DVD, whereas I've been streaming this.
Yeah, it's a weird change they made when they moved all these across to Disney+. So after Cobra Bubbles leaves and Lilo and Nani have an argument, Lilo runs off and hides in, originally it's a clothes dryer, but they changed it to like a pizza box hanging over a cupboard in the Disney Plus version, presumably because they don't want kids climbing in clothes dryers. Now, there's a lot of other things they probably don't want kids doing in this film, like leathering other kids, but they kept that in, so...
One thing I love about this change is, in fact, we haven't mentioned this so far, but all of the backgrounds in this film are these gorgeous watercolours. And it took me a while to get used to it because it's such a stark contrast to the cell animated characters that there's such a split between characters and backgrounds, which means anything that's going to move, in this case, say the pizza box or the dryer, is very obvious because it's not a watercolour. But in this scene, the table around the pizza box is also a watercolour, so I think they may have even gone in and completely redone the background, which is quite impressive. It's a lot of effort for something that I suppose is a valid issue, but also, as you say, there are other things in this film that maybe were more pressing. But just a shout out to going in and actually changing the backgrounds, which, as I say, throughout this film are all gorgeous.
This film is incredibly colourful, and maybe it just stood out to me more because just before watching it, I was putting together screen captures for our YouTube video for Dinosaur, which is the brownest, ugliest film ever created. So seeing something bright and colourful was such a pleasant change. The only other bit that really stood out for me during Cobra Bubbles' first visit is, again, to show that Lilo is fairly unhinged. He finds her making voodoo dolls of her friends, in inverted commas, because they've upset her. When I saw her stuffing grass into them, I honestly thought it was marijuana, and I was like, man, they're really pulling no punches on the abusive household in this film, are they? Jeez.
I enjoy Lilo talking to Bubbles and saying, have you killed anyone? And he just responds with, we're getting off the topic.
Yeah, that's such a good response.
So as you mentioned earlier, we have this fight between Nani and Lilo, and they reconcile in just an incredibly sweet moment. One thing I like about this scene is that we see that Lilo has a hobby that seems to be taking Polaroid pictures of fat tourists. And she just has a whole wall of them. It's not referenced ever again. It's just this nice little character quirk. After this, we see Nani peeking in on Lilo, who is praying for an angel because she's just so lonely, which is heartbreaking. And then we just get a hard cut to Stitch having crash landed and leaving the wreckage looking maniacal in the middle of the jungle.
Yeah, Penny and Jake got the rescuers, and Lilo gets psychotic murderous alien. So we get a bit of Stitch acclimatizing to where he is, fairly quickly gets hit by a truck, and taken to a dog kennel where Lilo and Nani are going to adopt a dog. I'm going to say this, I'm really on Nani's side throughout this film, but this is not the solution to the problem.
No, I was thinking this at the time. I was thinking this is not going to help your case with Bubbles, that you're like, hey, I know we're struggling, but we've just taken on the responsibility for a dog too. Can I just point out that we're now at the 25-minute mark of a film called Lilo and Stitch, and we're only just introducing Lilo to Stitch.
But I don't think that's necessarily the wrong call. You look at Beauty and the Beast, the inciting incident about 25 minutes is Belle and Beast interacting for the first time.
Oh, I suppose I'm not necessarily saying it as a bad thing. I like that we've taken, 10 minutes establishing Stitch and 15 minutes establishing Lilo. I think that's good character groundwork, though actually there's a lot more to Stitch than we see in those 10 minutes. But it's just interesting that as a film that is known for being sort of actually quite comedic and light-hearted, there's a lot of character groundwork that comes before it.
So the way Lilo and Stitch do finally meet is Nani lets Lilo go in and choose a dog from the ones in the pound. All the other dogs have been scared off and are hiding, so Stitch is the only one there. Stitch, overhearing that they are going to take him out, realises that disguising himself as a dog might be the best way to get around Dr. Jumba and Pleakley, who have now arrived on Earth and are chasing after him. So he pulls in his extra arms and presses in a lot of his alien appendages and disguises himself as a dog. Now, when Lilo brings Stitch out, Nani and the person running it are horrified because they're like, that's not a dog. And the person running the kennels says, it was dead. When we brought it in last night, it was dead. So why did you put it in a cage with living dogs if you thought it was dead? What the hell are you doing?
I think we can agree that the woman running the pound makes a few mistakes. There's a bit in the moment where Lilo is naming Stitch Stitch, and the woman says, that's not a real name. It's like, it's a dog. You can call it whatever you want. And also, Stitch is a perfectly fine name.
What kind of person sees a young orphan child get her first pet and say, that's a stupid name, you can't call it that? What's wrong with you? It's the same kind of person who leaves corpses in with live dogs, is what it is.
One thing I love about the name, and I only realised watching this today, was that Stitch is a play on 626, or vice versa. And I do wonder whether there was supposed to be a scene where Stitch introduces himself, but because of his strange speech, Lilo interprets it as Stitch. But I don't think it's needed. I think it's just a nice sort of, oh yeah, it's 626 and Stitch.
Going into this film for the first time, and even my memory of it to a degree, was that Stitch is just an agent of destruction, but isn't particularly smart. But actually, it establishes it that Stitch is incredibly smart. And one bit I really like in this sequence is when Stitch first meets Lilo, and it's just the two of them, Stitch says a couple of things. And Lilo's like, this is what I want. He can talk. And then the kennel owner says, dogs can't talk. And you see Stitch think, I should probably stop talking then. Which again is just clever writing.
Well, to really sell how smart he is, the only reason he is doing this is to use Lilo as a human meat shield. Damn, this is dark at times.
Meat shield and Stitch. I don't know at what point I wrote this in the film, but I've got a note here that just says, okay, I love Nani. I think she's fantastic.
She is excellent. As I say, to me, she is the hero of this film.
It may well be at this point that I realised how much I love Nani as a character.
So, equipped with his meat shield in hand, Stitch seeks to resort to his programming, which will involve being irresistibly drawn to any major large cities, of which, after going from one side of the island to another, Lilo tells him it's nice living on an island with no major cities, and it's just surrounded by water, so Stitch is just lost. His purpose in life is to destroy, and he's trapped, but he also can't leave Lilo, otherwise he'll get captured and torn apart by Jumbo and Pleakley.
And again, in my memory and before seeing this film, I was very much like, okay, it's a sad little girl and she has a wacky alien and they have some adventures, but that's not what this is. The way you've just described Stitch is that he's trapped in a situation that he can't get out of, with someone who can't really meet his needs, and if he doesn't stay with that person, he'll be taken away. That's the same description as Lilo. Very early on I wrote, man, Stitch is dealt a bum hand in life. Like, basically his first experience of anything is being imprisoned, and then, like, sentenced to live out his life in exile. But Lilo's been dealt a crap hand too, and again, really good paralleling, but it's not too heavy-handed. There's not a moment where Lilo says, I guess we're just like each other, aren't we? And here's the ways we're like each other. It's left there for you to gradually realise and go, yeah, I see what you're doing here, Disney.
It's wonderfully handled, particularly around the fact that both characters are anarchic and difficult in their own way, but then with Stitch, it's so much more exaggerated. And with Stitch specifically, it's explicitly stated to be part of his programming and his purpose, which, would you say that about Lilo? No, her attitude and her behaviour is because of the hand she's been dealt in life, and that's what the film starts dealing with Stitch as well. I love the parallel between the two of them. I do think it's excellent. And alongside this, we get just a wonderful montage of Stitch being a terrible dog. Lilo's trying to teach him just basic dog things and treat him like a dog. There's a bit where she's trying to teach him to play fetch. He doesn't fetch the stick. She squirts him with the water bottle, so he just steals the water bottle off her and throws it, and she ends up having to go and get the water bottle. Just this lovely little montage of their first day together, of Lilo just struggling with this difficult and stubborn creature. And it all culminates in a sequence where Lilo and Stitch are at Nani's work, which, again, I absolutely love that she's having to take her sister and her sister's dog to work with her, even though she can't. And ultimately, in the end, it ends up getting her fired. We just get this constant barrage of being told, like, Nani is not coping because she is not equipped to deal with this.
We're also introduced the character of David, who is doing some fire devil sticky shenanigans, and there's clearly a bit of chemistry between him and Nani. And again, we see another thing that Nani's sacrificing. Not only is she sacrificing her time and all her energy to look after Lilo, but she's also sacrificing her opportunity to pursue relationships. And there's a moment in the scene which I think is one of the most realistically childish things that Lilo does, where David's just walking past. He's not even like looking in Lilo's direction. She just shouts to him and says, I've got a new dog. And that's exactly what kids do when they've got something. They're just like, look, it's a thing I've got, look at it.
Meanwhile, at the restaurant, we also see that Jumbo and Pleakley, who have been disguised and have been followed. I say disguised, loosely disguised. They're still clearly aliens. They're just wearing a Hawaiian shirt and a hat and a wig, which is a whole thing.
Do you get slight shipping vibes between these two characters, Liam, or is it just me being insane?
I hadn't thought about that, so maybe it's you being insane, but I kind of love it anyway.
Okay, so in this scene, Jumbo calls Pleakley ugly, and Pleakley is visibly hurt by this. And then later on, Pleakley's trying on the wig, he uses disguise himself as a human woman and just looks a bit fondly at it. And then Jumbo wants to try it on as well. And basically, these two, long past the point where they should be spending time together, are spending time together. So maybe I'm just imagining it, but I definitely think there's an argument to be made there.
Well, one bit of evidence for you there is what I love about this scene is they've come to the restaurant to capture Stitch, but we can see that they've clearly sat down for a multiple course meal at this restaurant, and they've had most of it before they decided to catch Stitch. And we get a nice little sequence where Stitch is captured and ends up biting Pleakley's head, and David and Nani have to rescue this woman from Stitch. This is what gets Nani fired. Not in a malicious way either, it's just a case of the manager saying that this isn't working. I can't have an employee who can't focus on their job and is going to bring trouble in. It's very sympathetic towards her. Whereas it would be so easy to have made all of the situations she's in cruel towards her. But dejected, Nani and Lilo take Stitch home for the first time. Lilo's very excited to bring her dog home, but Nani's clearly very stressed. She's just lost her job and realizes that this dog is far more trouble and responsibility than they can both handle. Because again, if Lilo can't handle this dog, it's going to fall onto her, and she's already stretched so thin. Which all culminates in Nani saying that they're going to take Stitch back to the pound, to which Lilo interjects saying, Ohana. Ohana means family, and family means nobody gets left behind. Which leads to a wonderful little bit where Nani's basically saying, like, he's not family. He hasn't been here that long, to which Lilo just responds, neither have I. And again, it's just this lovely parallel between the characters. I love it. This is kind of the emotional core of the film, is the idea of family and looking after each other no matter the circumstances. And we see in Stitch's facial animation that he kind of understands what's going on here, and that actually these people, for some strange reason, care about him.
Yeah, this is where we start to get the turning point for Stitch. Jumba, observing them from outside, is curious to see what a creature whose only purpose is to destroy does when it doesn't have anything left to destroy. And we see Stitch starting to basically have an existential crisis. You know, again, great fodder for a kid's film.
Now, I don't know how much I'm reading into this, but Jumba's line about what will he do when there's nothing left to destroy, is that playing on the fact that they are a broken family, and that whilst he physically destroys things, there is the parallel as well of, you know, if Stitch had been found by a happy, functioning nuclear family, he could have destroyed that. Whereas the only people who could look after Stitch are people who essentially have nothing to lose but each other.
I think that's exactly what the meaning of it is meant to be. And again, it's just another level of this film being incredibly moving and sad. Again, we get a really nice sequence of Stitch digging through Lilo's books until he finds the ugly duckling, which Lilo explains to him.
You say she explains to him, it's the ugly duckling retold over 2 pages.
Look, we're not going to waste time retelling the ugly duckling to an audience. Stitch realizes that not only is he growing up around people who aren't his own, he doesn't have any people. He doesn't have a family that he's come from. He can't remember one.
Another thing I love about this scene is Lilo is so excited to bring Stitch home that she's made him a little bed. She actually gives him her doll, which is adorable. Granted, she also gives him coffee, but, you know, like, points for effort.
Again, that's such a good throwaway joke where she's just got him a little kid's bottle full of coffee because she's like, oh, that's what adults drink, so I'll just give Stitch that, which obviously is terrible.
Again, she is not equipped to be looking after another creature.
The next day, Cobra Bubbles visits again. Once again, not impressed by the progress Nani's made, given she's now lost her job, and he sees that she has adopted what is ostensibly a dog, and the dog just throws a book in his face. Is it a book or a suitcase?
I think it's a book, yeah. Which, if a dog throws a book in my face, I'm asking questions.
So Bubbles makes it clear that not only does Nani need to find a new job, but they need to get the dog sorted out. So we get a montage of Nani trying to find more work, whilst Lilo is teaching Stitch how to be a model citizen. And Lilo, being a big Elvis fan, says Elvis Presley was a model citizen. And I was like, I forgot about that.
Yeah, we haven't really talked about the Elvis thing, but this isn't a musical. But obviously there's a few montages. As with a montage, you're going to need a song to go over it. And I think almost all of the music used in the film are Elvis songs, which is fantastic. I just think it's a really nice choice of music for the characters and for the tone of the film.
It works way better than it should do.
Again, I think what it's really doing is Elvis isn't really the music of choice for a 6-year-old girl. What this is telling us is it's building up the image of Lilo's parents as either her mum or her dad were big Elvis fans, and so that's going to rub off onto a child. And obviously if that child loses that parent, they're going to grasp onto whatever threads they can. And it's just this really nice little bit of storytelling in the background.
So during the sequence, Nani is trying to get various jobs, and Stitch's chaotic nature invariably ruins them, although we can see Stitch is trying to be better. One of the jobs Nani goes for seems to be being a lifeguard with Pamela Anderson. There is a very curvy blonde in Pamela's signature red swimming suit one piece that is a lifeguard.
Yeah, if you haven't seen this, the word that comes to mind to describe it would be bodacious. It's probably the only time that word makes sense, but yeah. Weirdly enough, that is the one part of the montage I'm not a huge fan of. Not the Pamela Anderson lifeguard, but it's at this point that Stitch is literally dressed up as Elvis playing the guitar, and it draws a crowd of people, one of whom swoons, and I don't know why, but Stitch dressed as Elvis and a woman swooning over him just breaks the realism of the film for me. And this is a film with intergalactic aliens.
I get what you're saying, because we've established early on, every time someone sees Stitch, they go, that is not a dog. So it's clear that people can see Stitch for what Stitch is. So if someone took their clearly not a dog, dressed it up as Elvis, and it was stood on its back legs playing the guitar and singing Elvis songs, you would start to question what the hell is going on. You know, the internet went crazy for Keyboard Cat, and this is way more impressive.
But all of my problems aside, the scene serves its purpose, which is it's one last job that Nani doesn't get because of Stitch. And it's also Stitch is failing to be a model citizen despite his efforts. We get a nice moment where both Nani and Lilo lean up against the now knocked over lifeguard seat and throw aside the jobs section of the local newspaper that Nani was using, and Lilo throws aside her picture of Elvis, which is quite a sweet little moment between the two. But luckily, to save the day, we've got lovely, lovely David with 2 surfboards. Now, you said that you're always on Nani's side, except for adopting a dog. Similarly, I'm always on David's side, except with taking a dog out on a surfboard.
I'm on David's side for almost all of this film, except right at the end when he's helping out Nani, and he says, "You can just date me and we'll call it even." That's creepy. You're such a nice guy, David, and you had to do something like that. He knows at that point she likes him, and he's not just pushing it, but still, boundaries.
Despite my problems with David taking a dog on a surfboard with them, this scene is lovely. It's very much Nani's lowest point in terms of finding a job, and David is there where they just have fun together to try and forget about all the troubles and stresses that they're under. We've got a wonderful song over this. Hawaiian Roller Coaster Ride, one of the few non-Elvis songs on the soundtrack. Throughout the scene, we see them surfing, and as I say, just trying to forget about all the stress that they have. There's a lovely moment where Nani and David are building a sandcastle over Lilo, and Stitch in the background looks on and just builds a small sandcastle over himself, using a little leaf as the flag that they stick in, just telling us that he really is trying. He's seeing a family, and he doesn't necessarily realise that he wants to be part of it. He just realises he wants to do the things that they are doing. It's what he is drawn to now he has no purpose. I think it's just a wonderful little moment.
Of course, like everything in Nani, Lilo and Stitch's lives, it has to be immediately ruined. In this case, Jumbo and Pleakley show up and try and capture Stitch, and he manages to fight them off, but in the process is knocked off the surfboard and starts to sink. Lilo goes after him and is rescued by Nani, and David manages to swim down and rescue Stitch, who fortunately manages to survive. Again, David doing great stuff here, just reel it in a bit, mate.
One thing that's quite shocking about this sequence is Stitch not being able to swim. He is dragging Lilo down, and Nani goes down to rescue them, and to get Stitch off Lilo, she just kicks him off. Which, don't get me wrong, if it's a choice between your sister and your dog, you're gonna do whatever you can to save your sister.
Well, hang on, let's not... It depends on the sister and it depends on the dog, doesn't it? Let's be honest.
Okay, if it's your sister who you are responsible for, and there is a social worker on the beach watching you, you're going to choose your sister.
Yeah, I guess.
Because, yeah, after recovering and getting to the beach, we see that Cobra Bubbles is there, who reminds Nani that this isn't working and he's going to be by in the morning to pick up Lilo. And as I said earlier, it's just a wonderful shift in performance from Ving Rhames, who is so empathetic towards Nani, realizing that, look, you are trying, I can see that, but it's not good enough, which is such a hard thing for really anyone looking after someone else to hear.
It's one of those horrible situations where there's no good ending or right answer to it, which again is a lot like things are in real life, particularly for children in these situations. I think the bit for me, which I think is the emotional beat of this film that hits hardest, is after hearing this, Nani is not only trying to keep it together for herself, but she sits down with Lilo and she's trying to find a way to tell her this and make it sound like a positive, and that this is going to be a good thing for Lilo. And you can tell it's tearing her up inside. Even in this situation when she knows she's going to lose Lilo, she's still trying to make it out to be a positive and make it something that Lilo can feel good about. Yeah, it's really, really heavy going, but again, really well written, well performed. And we've not touched a lot on the animation of this film. It uses for its characters the block colouring that we criticise Pocahontas for and saying it's inexpressive, but I think in terms of animation, the characters in this, even though they are that same level of block colouring, they're so much more expressive and there's so much emotion in the way these characters interact. I think it all just adds together and makes a very, very powerful sequence.
I think the key difference between the animation in this and Pocahontas is they're not trying to go for realistic facial proportions or body proportions, so you can be a lot more expressive. There's an odd bit actually in this scene where after Lilo and Nani walk off, David turns to Stitch, who by all accounts is a dog, and says, "They really thought they had a chance until you came along." And first of all, that is heartbreaking, the idea of like, I knew they never stood a chance, like, but they really thought they stood a chance. But why are you blaming it on a dog? And also the dog doesn't understand you. The dog in this situation does, but as far as you're aware, the dog doesn't. After they go home then, we get what, to me, is probably the most moving moment in all of the canon, which is Nani, in trying to explain what's going to happen to Lilo, she just sings Aloha Oi to her, and it's just this beautiful moment between the two of them.
After this then, they all retire, and in a sequence where I think I don't quite get where they're going with this, Stitch makes it clear he's going to leave, and Lilo, again, hurt by this, is like, yeah, everybody leaves me. And Stitch goes away, ostensibly to look for family, I think. I don't really get what's going on with this sequence. It just feels like a weird tonal shift, but he goes out to meet Dr. Jumba, who explains that he doesn't have a family, he was just created, and that's kind of it, basically.
It's a really odd scene because the way it is written, I think we're supposed to believe that Stitch is leaving for Lilo, because we've just had that moment with David before, basically suggesting that Stitch ruins things. But the way it is performed and animated and the writing around Lilo is that it's almost as if Stitch doesn't feel part of this family, so he has to find his own family. And I don't think either of those things are communicated well enough for it to be that. I mean, if I had to stake my claim on any, it's that Stitch doesn't feel a part of this family, so he's going out to find his own. But I don't think that has been properly set up before this. It just kind of comes out of nowhere. As I say, there's the bit with the Sandcastle and the Ugly Duckling book that are clearly supposed to feed into that, but it's not a strong enough thread for a conclusion with him to literally leave whilst Lilo is awake.
It feels a bit at odds with everything else we're getting up to this point, because we've praised the way we get the parallels between these two characters and that relationship gradually builds. And I think if either of them was the main character, it would work. So either it's, if Stitch was the main character, it'd be Stitch saying, I care about this family, but I need to do this myself. Or if Lilo was the main character, it would be, you're doing something selfish to put yourself forward, which is what everybody does for me. And if you're going to be selfish, then fine, I don't want anything to do with you. And it seems to be trying to do both of those things, but they're a little bit at odds with each other, particularly given we've kind of already moved past this point with the relationship between these two characters. It's the only sequence in the film where I think the beat is a little bit off.
So we cut to the next morning where, in another just beautiful moment, we see Nani at the table crying, and then as soon as Lilo walks in, she tries to hide that fact and get Lilo ready because Bubbles is going to be coming for her soon. Lilo tells Nani that Stitch left. And again, that whole beat, as you say, just feels like it's either not communicating what they wanted it to, or it just shouldn't be there at all.
I mean, it's possible that you and I are both idiots.
I mean, I'd say it's more than possible, but yeah, that is definitely an option. The doorbell goes. Nani, thinking it's Bubbles to pick up Lilo, prepares herself. Instead, she sees that it is David, who is saying that he's potentially found a job for Nani, but they've got to be quick. And so Nani rushes to talk to the owner of the store to inquire about the job. Now, I feel David could have stayed with Lilo at this point.
Yeah, but he's not trying to become an older brother. He's trying to start dating Nani, and he's not going to achieve that by not spending time with Nani.
So Nani realises she's got the choice. She can get the job, but she's going to have to leave Lilo alone for a moment, which she decides to do, which, I mean, she should never do, but she decides to do. It is a tough ultimatum. Like, that's a really hard decision to make. At this point, Stitch gets away from Jumba and Pleakley, who by this point have been fired from their mission to collect Stitch by the Grand Councilwoman. So Jumba just says, great, we don't have to worry about the people of Earth anymore. I can just do what I want and do what will get 626 back to me. So Stitch runs away back to Lilo, but he's chased by Jumba. Hijinks ensue, the house ends up destroyed, and Lilo and Stitch escape them.
Seeing all this chaos kick off, and Nani rushes back only to see Cobra Bubbles loading Lilo into a car to take her away. Nani explains that things are complicated, but she's what Lilo needs, and Bubbles, furious, gestures to the ruined house and says, is this what Lilo needs? And again, there's no one who's wrong in this situation, which makes it difficult and complicated. But this is the turning point for Lilo as a character, where she sees that her obsession with Stitch and having this wacky animal in her life has had real consequences, and because of that, she's going to lose Nani.
Two things about this scene. First of all, for a moment, I forgot how Bubbles ended up back there, but then I remembered that Lilo calls him during all of the chaos and says my favourite line of the film, which is, oh good, my dog found the chainsaw, which is not something you should say on the phone to a social worker.
Well, maybe you should if you're a child in that situation.
And my second point is that as a social worker, Bubbles really should have a child lock on his car.
That is a very, very fair point, because yeah, Lilo just goes out the opposite door and runs off into the jungle. Yeah, I had him down as a consummate professional until you pointed that out.
Like, if he goes back to his superiors and that is how it ended, he's getting fired. That's on him. But very much in an out of the frying pan into the fryer, Lilo catches up with Stitch to basically blame him for all of her problems. He reveals that he is an alien, and at this point, they are captured by Captain Gantu, who also doesn't seem to care about the rules of not disturbing the locals. He doesn't care that he's picked up Lilo alongside this, but hey, he's happy. He's captured 626 straight away and is taking him back to the Grand Councilwoman.
Just to be clear, Captain Gantu is an elephant-shark alien hybrid that's about 2 stories tall. There's no level of stealth going on here.
Despite capturing both Lilo and Stitch, Stitch manages to escape through a small gap, very much like an octopus. It always makes me uncomfortable watching this moment where he's squeezing through this tiny gap, but he manages to escape. He's not leaving Lilo. There's a bit where he's sort of holding onto the glass and looking at her, but then the ship goes into hyperdrive and he's just flung back. But as soon as he lands, he's captured by Jumba and Pleakley. And looking for Lilo, Nani happens onto the scene and is horrified at the sight of these 2 aliens who have captured her sister's dog. There's this really nice moment where she's just begging them to tell them where Lilo is. There's also a very strange moment where Nani sees Stitch and she's realised he's an alien. and has seen all of these things, but she wants to know where Lilo is, and she says, "Talk, I know you can." And then when Stitch talks, she's horrified and hits him, but it's like, you've seen much scarier things than your dog talking at this point.
If only she lived in the world of Oliver and Company, where dogs stealing cars was just par for the course, you'd probably be way more chill with this. We're very much into our third act, and the final action sequence is Jumba, Pleakley, Nani and Stitch flying after Gantu. Stitch jumps down and they're flying back and forth and basically trying to free Lilo from the pod. And Gantu by this point has lost his patience with Stitch and is determined to destroy him.
This is a really strange final set piece for your film that in a way almost makes me feel that they didn't realise how to tell the story that they ended up telling. So I think this is a good place to talk about sort of a general feeling I have about this film, which is that to me, it feels like this film started as a story about a girl and her alien. But as they were writing it, it became a story about a young woman having to look after her sister and who isn't coping. However, we keep getting pulled back to that original story, and this final set piece feels more like that, whereas to me, the more interesting story is Nani's. But the question is, well, how would you have an action set piece for Nani's story? Would it be them trying to get Lilo back from the social workers? Because that's not really okay. So they have to have an equivalent of that, and it has to be getting Lilo back. So they have her captured by an alien who, so far in this film, hasn't really been a feature. Maybe Gantu could have been involved with Jumba and Pleakley. Maybe one of either Jumba or Pleakley could have gone rogue, like how Jumba was doing moments ago, and that's where you have your serious showdown set piece. Or maybe you just can't have a showdown set piece in this story. But to me, this final set piece doesn't really work with the rest of the film.
I definitely agree there is a tension in this film, because it definitely feels like they sat down and went, right, we want a film about a girl and her alien, and then half the team went away and worked on the alien side of that, and the other half went and worked on the girl side of that film. It took me a little while to wrap my head around this finale, not in terms of what's happening. It's a fairly standard chasey action sequence with spaceships scenario. But the reason it's not about Nani is because Nani doesn't have much of a character arc. And that's not that I think she's a bad character, but what I mean is Nani is already prepared to do anything for Lilo at the start of this film. So there's no further she can go. This is just her automatic reaction to that. But we've already had the culmination of Lilo's arc, which is appreciating everything Nani does and realising that her holding on to Stitch is selfish. So this is the culmination of Stitch's character arc, where he realises that in being the way he is, he's put the people he cares about in danger. So this is Stitch's redemption to free Lilo, whereas obviously Stitch could at this point just run away and go cause more chaos, but obviously his character arc has come full circle and he's no longer that kind of person, so this is Stitch's redemption. So that's why I think it has to happen this way and can't have Nani driving the action in that way.
For what you've explained then, I think a more appropriate ending would have been Stitch solving the problem of Jumba and Pleakley.
By eating them.
I mean, that's one option, definitely. But because they are a force who have been set on Stitch by the Galactic Federation and the Grand Councilwoman, it all has to come back to her, which, to be fair, we do get a lovely sequence after Stitch has saved Lilo and taken down Gantu's ship. The Grand Councilwoman shows up and just captures Stitch immediately, making me wonder, why didn't she just do this if she's so capable? But as Stitch is being escorted away, he has this lovely encounter with the Grand Councilwoman explaining that he'd like to say goodbye because it's his family. And yeah, it's just this lovely little moment. And it's what the Grand Councilwoman was asking for at the start of the film was some indication that 626 is more than just a monster and doesn't need to be exiled.
And this is where Clopan has the reprise of who is a monster and who is a man. And you're like, wait a second. Again, I think this is a sequence where it'd be so easy for the Grand Councilwoman to just be a villain that needs to be beaten. Even Captain Gantu, once he's sort of defeated, I guess, he just sort of sits around looking a bit sad on his spaceship. Like, he's not thrown to his death or anything. It's not that kind of film. And him and the Grand Councilwoman are just like, look, this has been a big mess. We just don't want anything to do with this anymore. And a nice resolution is she says, well, I'm still going to send Stitch into exile, but Lilo and Nani are going to be his guardians, which obviously is her sort of official way of confirming that they can stay together as a family. Now, I don't know why she lets Jumba stay, because he is very clearly a criminal.
Well, one thing I like about this is, as they're all leaving, the Grand Councilwoman mentions to one of her guards, she points to Jumba and Pleakley and says, don't let those two anywhere near my ship. Basically leaving them in exile too. And I suppose that's why it worked, is because it's two birds, one stone. She's also exiling Jumba at the same time, but exiling him to a civilian planet, you're right, is incredibly dangerous.
She's established that Stitch has changed and has redeemed himself and found his humanity. She's got no such evidence about Jumba. He should definitely be in prison.
It's a really nice moment, and I think Chris Sanders' performance as Stitch, speaking to the Grand Councilwoman, is so endearing, and this is why I put Stitch up there as the most adorable characters. It's mostly the voice. The voice is just incredible.
And with that, we get a final montage of Lilo and Nani's new life. Now Stitch is a part of it and is basically not a monster anymore. As I say, Pleakley and Jumba have somehow wormed their way into this relationship as well. I don't know why they put up with them, but fine.
It's to set up the TV series.
Ah, yes, of course.
One thing I love about this ending is the Grand Councilwoman says that they're responsible for Stitch and therefore they have the support of the Galactic Federation and that they will be checking in. And basically what this says is that the solution to struggling families is socialised state support. Who'd have thought? All of their emotional problems are still going to be there, but the one thing that's really helpful is they're now having their financial problems fixed by the Grand Councilwoman. It's amazing how removing that major stress just improves their lives dramatically.
That, and I think Lilo has gone through a character change as well. That probably makes some difference. At no point in this final sequence does she leather any other children.
Well, at least not that we see.
Well, no, but you could say that about anything in any film.
At no point in Dumbo that we see does he leather that mouse. Just as a final note, this is the first time I actually watched all of the credits, because over the credits after this montage we get a selection of Polaroids that they've all taken together, showing their life after this point. And the final Polaroid, and this is the first time I noticed, is the burnt and slightly damaged picture of Lilo and her family, and in the gap that has been burnt away, underneath they've put a picture of Stitch showing how he's now part of the family. And I hadn't seen it before, and watching it today, it just really got to me. And I was like, that's such a lovely final image where they've amended the photo for him.
And that is Lilo and Stitch. So before Liam and I decide whether Lilo and Stitch is worthy of making our list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics, Liam, is there anything else we need to talk about regarding this film?
There is just one thing. We need to decide which character in Lilo and Stitch is the most sexy, the most inappropriately sexualized for a children's film. So Ben, which character in Lilo and Stitch is the sexiest, and why is it the Pamela Anderson bodacious lifeguard?
I mean, I feel that is a sentence that answers itself. It's a weird inclusion because this film came out in 2002. Now, I never watched Baywatch, but my understanding is Baywatch was like a 90s thing, so maybe it's just because there's a lot of surfing and beaches in this film. But yeah, no doubt it's Pamela Anderson. It's not actually Pamela Anderson, but it effectively is.
I will say, until you reminded me of that character, because she's only in it for a moment, I'd kind of forgotten and overlooked her, and until you reminded me, I was all in ready to make the case for David, because hot damn, those are some great abs, but you can't compete with someone just that bodacious.
The thing about David is, Lilo says to him at one point that she's read Nani's diary and she knows that Nani likes him because she says he's got a great butt and has fancy hair. And his response is, she thinks my hair is fancy, knowing he knows he's got a great butt.
So we're both in agreement on Sexiest character, but are we in agreement on whether or not this film is going to make the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics? So first off, we just need to retrieve the scroll from the vault, but as I go to open the vault door, I can see that the young girl we keep as a guardian inside the vault seems to have nailed it shut. So we're going to have to take the back exit, I'm afraid. Just a moment. And we're in, and I have with me the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics. Now, Ben, I see no need to be coy in this situation. Despite the fact that what I feel is so great about this film, the relationship with the sisters, the parallels between Lilo and Stitch, I feel those all came after the initial pitch of a film about a girl and her alien. And as a result, I think that some of the story beats maybe get bogged down in that original pitch. Despite that, I think the story they end up telling is one of the most unique and wonderful in the Disney canon. In fact, a few years ago, we both individually worked through the animated classics and ended up ranking them from our favourites to our least favourites. And for me, this is the film that knocked Dumbo out of the top 10. And I bloody love Dumbo, so there's no question for me. Despite its flaws, this is one of the most emotionally satisfying films in the canon. So for me, I absolutely want to put this on the list.
Now, I've been criticised on this podcast for praising a film all the way through the episode, and then when it comes to this point, saying I don't think it's good and it shouldn't go on the list. If you'd asked me before this second watch, from my memory of this film, I would have said I don't think it's a very strong film and it's not going on the list. Normally, before these rewatches, even though I watch them on their own merits, I have a pretty good idea as to whether I think they're going on or not. Spoiler warning, The Lion King was always going to go on, Dinosaur was never going to go on. There's some that I'm very on the fence about, and I genuinely don't know until the most recent watch. This is the first time in the 38 episodes we've done of this podcast where I've gone in confident that I will not put it on the list, and I've changed my mind, because, my god, this film has some amazing stuff in it. Visually, I don't think it's particularly special, but it's bright and colourful and does the job. I think the action sequences are solid. I think I've really changed my mind about Stitch. Don't get me wrong, I don't think he's the top 3 most adorable characters, and he's certainly not my favourite Disney character. He's no Jafar.
I would love to see Jafar with Stitch as a sidekick.
Jafar and Stitch. Lilo and Iago. But even though I'm not the biggest Stitch fan, the emotional beats of this film work so well. I feel there's very clear character arcs with these two characters. I buy their relationship, I get the parallels between them. Everything with Nani and Lilo is heartbreaking but incredibly moving and well done. I definitely don't think it's mawkish or manipulative anyway. I think it's very grounded and realistic, which again is incredibly impressive for a film that, as you say, opens with 10 minutes of space politics about genetic engineering. It's insane. This is also one of the funniest Disney films we've had so far. There's very consistently a lot of really good jokes in this. Not all of it lands, admittedly, and they're trying to appeal to a broad age group. Some of the jokes are aimed at adults and some are aimed at kids, but again, that's what I expect from a Disney film. It's not a musical, but again, that's not a point against it. I really did enjoy watching this film. The poster for Lilo and Stitch is stark white with Stitch sat in the middle looking chaotic, and various famous Disney characters, Pinocchio, Belle...
That's it.
Pinocchio, Belle, Dumbo, etc. are all looking in disgust at Stitch, and the tagline is, there's one in every family. And I feel that poster says more than it thinks it does, because this film isn't the biggest departure in terms of Disney. It's certainly not a Atlantis the Lost Empire or a Big Hero 6, but it is very different to certainly the Renaissance films, and yet it works exceptionally well. So I can't believe I'm saying it, but for me, it's definitely a yes for this film.
Success. I'm very happy with that, and I very happily write Lilo and Stitch on the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics and hand it back to the 6-year-old guardian of the vault.
That leaves just a few last things. Thank you so much for listening to Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics. We put out a new episode of this looking at Disney films each and every week. Our podcast can be found on SoundCloud, Spotify, a host of other streaming and hosting platforms, as well as a special enhanced version of YouTube, where we also put out various other content, including interviews, edits, and analysis. If you did enjoy listening to the podcast, make sure to do all the usual liking, subscribing, etc. If you didn't enjoy it, you should still do that, but just do it more reluctantly or ironically. And of course, there's always more Disney films to talk about. On which note, Liam, which film are we looking at next time?
Well, Ben, I hope you enjoyed our foray into a nuanced look at nature versus nurture and the true meaning of family, because next week we're looking at Treasure Island in space. That's right, we've finally reached Musker and Clement's intended opus that they were trying to get off the ground for years. We are looking at 2002's Treasure Planet. So be sure to give it a watch and join us next time for Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics.